Today we are looking at a case from the mid-19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Anton Probst was born in Germany in 1843. He was one of 3 children, and his father had always worked hard as a carpenter. At the time of his birth, many German people were dissatisfied with the lack of opportunities available to them in their homeland, particularly after the failure of the 1848 revolution. Many left the country, and between 1860 and 1890, there were only 3 years in which German people were not the largest nationality of immigrants to make a new life in America. During the 19th century, over 5 million German people came to the United States, one of them being Anton Probst, who arrived in New York in 1863. His arrival was during the period of the American Civil War that had started 2 years earlier in 1861. Young Anton saw this as an opportunity to make money, and just a few hours after arriving in America, he enlisted into the Union Army. He did not do this because he felt some type of patriotic duty to the country where he was going to try and build his future, but because, like all new Union Army recruits, he was paid $300 to do so. However, Anton had no plans to actually go to battle and decided that it was such an easy way to make $300 that as soon as he was able, he deserted his regiment and would then sign up with a different one, again receiving the $300 enlistment. He continued to do this as often as he could until in 1865, when the war was coming to an end, he accidentally shot his own thumb off. He was subsequently discharged from the army. Despite all the money Anton had been paid for enlisting, by the end of 1865, he was poor and without work. He was living in Philadelphia, staying in lodging houses, and spending what money he had left in the bars and brothels of the city. His fortunes changed when he was offered work on a small farm just south of the city. It was owned by Mr. Christopher Deering, who himself had come to America from Ireland. Mr. Deering lived with his wife Julia and their 5 children. Their farm was small and only consisted of a few acres. They also had a small house and a barn and made money by raising cattle to sell. He was a hard-working gentleman who lived a modest life and had aspirations to make his farm a success and provide a nice home for his family. Anton was offered $15 a month plus room and board, although nothing like the $300 he would pick up each time he enlisted in the Union Army. It was honest work, and he could at least start to build his future. After all, he was still a young man, only 22 years old. Unlike Mr. Deering, however, Anton was not a hard worker and would do as little as possible on the farm. He would spend an incredible amount of time in the barn and was slow to complete even the most basic of tasks. This was something that was noticed by Mrs. Julia Deering. She also considered him to be a somewhat strange character. Not only was he a poor worker, she also felt quite uncomfortable in his presence and encouraged her husband to dispense with his services. Eventually he agreed, and just a few weeks after starting his employment at the Deering farm, Anton Probst was out of work and with no money to support himself. Fortunately, one of the workers from a Philadelphia charity hospital took pity on him after he claimed that he was in very poor health. They took him in, and he stayed there for the next few months until he was well enough to be released. At the end of February 1866, and by now in desperate need of work, Anton paid a visit to Mr. Deering. He explained about his illness and asked if he would be able to work there again. He said he would work much harder and in order to prove himself would accept less money. Previously, Mr. Deering had paid him $15 a month, but Anton said that he would gladly work for $10, and Mr. Deering could increase his wages when he realised what a hard worker he was. Mr. Deering felt a bit sorry for him. He remembered how difficult it had been when he first arrived in America from Ireland, and Anton had lost his thumb while serving in the Union Army. So he agreed to let him work on the farm again, and Anton did work very hard. He was polite and respectful and completed every task that he was given. Even Mrs. Deering started to think that maybe this young man, who had previously spent most of his time sitting around in the barn, could turn out to be a very useful farmhand. However, Anton had no plans to spend the next few years working for the Deerings. Although it provided a place to stay, food, shelter, and a salary, he had far bigger plans, and they did not include spending his days working as hard as he could for $10 a month. On the 7th of April 1866, Mr. Deering got up early. It was a cloudy day and had been raining for much of the night. He took out the horse and cart and prepared to go to Philadelphia. A cousin named Miss Elizabeth Dolan was coming to stay for a few days, which had greatly pleased Mrs. Deering, who was very much looking forward to the company. As Mr. Deering left, Anton and another casual farmhand named Cornelius Carey started working in the fields. The weather, however, was starting to get worse. It was now raining harder, so the two young farm workers sheltered under a large tree. Suddenly, without any provocation, Anton attacked Cornelius with an axe. He was far bigger and stronger than the young farmhand, and within a couple of minutes of taking shelter, Cornelius Carey was dead. Anton quickly carried the body to the barn, where he covered it with hay. No one had noticed that he had left the field. Mrs. Deering was busy sewing. She was anxious that everything should look its best for their visitor, and the children were helping to tidy the house. As Anton decided what to do next, Mrs. Deering and her son John came out of the house. Anton asked John if he would help him in the barn for a few minutes. As the 8-year-old boy entered, he hit him with the axe. Making sure he was dead, he covered the body with hay. Mrs. Deering was getting water, so Anton called her to come to the barn. She walked towards him, but as she turned to ask what he wanted, he hit her with the axe. After making sure she was dead, he placed her next to John and covered her body with hay. The other 3 children were still in the house: Tom, Annie, and baby Emma. One by one, Anton asked them to come to the barn. All of them met the same fate as their mother and brother, and he laid them neatly next to each other, covering them with hay. Mr. Deering arrived at around 1:30 in the afternoon. By now it had stopped raining. He was anxious that his wife see her cousin. After all, she had talked about little else all week. He stopped the horse and cart right outside the house. Anton was waiting for him. He helped Miss Dolan down from the cart and asked his master to quickly come to the barn, telling him that a cow was sick. Mr. Deering was surprised, as all the cows seemed fine when he had left in the morning. The 2 gentlemen walked to the barn, and as Mr. Deering looked at the cow, Anton attacked him with the axe. When he was sure that he was dead, he went back to the house, where Miss Dolan was waiting patiently outside. She asked where everyone was, and Anton replied that they were all waiting for her in the barn. She hurriedly walked over. She had been so looking forward to seeing Julia and the children. Just as she entered, however, Anton attacked her, and when he was sure she was dead, he placed her body alongside the others and covered it with hay. He then went into the house. He found $10 in Mr. Deering's wallet and $3 in Miss Dolan's purse. He changed his clothes into some of Mr. Deering's finest garments, shaved, and went through the family's possessions, helping himself to anything he thought he may be able to sell. He took some clothes, a watch, and a revolver before going to the kitchen for some food. Somewhat strangely, he made sure he fed the animals before leaving in the early evening at around 6:30. He did, however, forget to give the animals any water. The Deerings had a neighbour named Abraham Everett, who lived on a farm about a quarter of a mile away. Mr. Everett took a weekly newspaper, and every Sunday, one of the Deerings' children would go and collect the previous week's, so Mr. and Mrs. Deering could read it. Mr. Everett had noticed that no one had collected the paper, and his wife had also mentioned that she hadn't seen anyone at the Deering farm for a few days. It was now Wednesday, April the 11th, so wanting to see if everything was in order, Mr. Everett made his way across the field to his neighbour's property. Something seemed strange. There was no one home. The animals had also not been watered. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He then looked around. He thought that this really did seem odd. Where was everyone, and why had they all just disappeared? He peered through the windows of the house. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Mr. Everett went to see another farmer named Robert Wiles, who arrived with another gentleman named John Gould. Together they managed to open a window and enter the house. They could see that things were out of place. Drawers were open, and there were clothes on the floor, but there was no sign of the Deerings. Mr. Everett commented that it was all very mysterious and decided to inform the authorities. Before they arrived, John Gould took a look around the barn. Amongst the hay he saw something that he thought looked like a stocking, but as he got closer, he realised that it was actually a foot. He carefully started to remove the large amounts of hay from the area and found that underneath lay two bodies. He recognised one to be Christopher Deering, but did not know the identity of the lady who lay beside him. It was later identified to be Miss Elizabeth Dolan. When the authorities arrived, they started to search the barn and soon uncovered the gruesome sight of Mr. Deering's wife Julia and 4 of their children, as well as Cornelius Carey, all meticulously laid side by side in the barn. The only one of their children who was unharmed was the eldest, named William, who had gone to stay with his grandparents just a couple of days before the terrible crime occurred. The only person missing from the grisly discovery was the farmhand, Anton Probst, so the authorities set out to find him. Anton was in Philadelphia. He had rented a room at a boarding house run by a gentleman named William Leckford and spent the days following the murders, drinking and trying to sell the watch and the revolver that he had stolen. Strangely, however, he had made no attempt to leave the city. The police were on alert to apprehend a young German gentleman with a missing thumb. And on April the 12th, just one day after the bodies were discovered, a police officer named James Dorsey apprehended a man fitting the suspect's description. The young man denied he was the person the police were looking for. He denied knowing Christopher Deering and his family and told Officer Dorsey that he was not German, but French. Officer Dorsey, however, took him to the police station. Although the suspect continued to make out he was completely innocent, witnesses who knew the Deerings and their workers were sent for. Each one identified the young man in custody as the Deering's farmhand, Anton Probst. As news spread that the police had arrested the culprits, an angry mob gathered outside the police station. Afraid for the prisoner's safety, the local police chief instructed that Anton be moved to the Moyer-Mensing State Prison, where he would continue to be interviewed. Eventually he confessed to killing Cornelius Carey, but maintained that the other murders were done by another man, whose name he did not know. Despite his insistence that he had not been the main instigator in the terrible crime, he was charged with the murders at the Deering farm. The trial of Anton Probst began on the 25th of April. He denied the charges, and no one had seen him commit the crimes. A timeline was established, and witnesses were called who had seen the Deerings on the days preceding the murders, and had seen Christopher Deering collect Elizabeth Dolan in his horse and carts. Witnesses also testified to seeing the defendant drinking in taverns on the evening of Saturday, April the 7th. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for only 20 minutes before returning to find the defendant, Anton Probst, guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. Following the verdict, he continued to claim that another man was responsible, but as his execution date neared, he confessed that it was him alone who had committed the crimes. He wrote to his parents, informing them what he had done, and expressed how sorry he was for his actions. Anton Probst was hanged on the 8th of June, 1866. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, I would appreciate any feedback or comments you may have, and I hope to see you all in the next brief, case,